No mai, haere mai, na mihi nui kia koutou katoa ki tēnei hui, ko Catherine Hall toko ingoa. Greetings and welcome to this third in this, our webinar series, Dementia Rights are Human Rights. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Hall, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon. We've had such a good feedback on the first two webinars in the series, and so it's great to have so many people joining us this afternoon. So the first webinar in the series really provided us with a human rights framework for thinking about people living with dementia and their rights, but also the way that those of us who work in the sector can help and support them. The second webinar looked at the impact of COVID and the impact of that on human rights related issues. And this webinar then starts to look forward. It starts to ask the questions about how we can think differently about supporting people living with dementia and the way we do things, and really to challenge some of our existing thinking about that. So I'm really looking forward to it. This afternoon we're going to hear from Peri, from Daniella Greenwood, from Graeme Titcombe, and from Jack. So they're going to be talking about various ways in which we can think differently about what we do. Before then, though, I've got some housekeeping for the program. So as I think we've said before, we are trying out this new platform, Demio, so it does work a little bit differently to Zoom. So a few things about it. So your video camera and your microphone are turned off for this presentation, but we do want to hear from you. So please do make comment or send us questions in the chat box. You'll find the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. And when you're asking questions, please do make sure that you let us know who you're directing that question to. Also, if you want to turn the chat box off at all during the webinar this afternoon, you can do that on the horizontal arrow that's at the top right of your screen. The other thing is that we will be holding the questions to the end of the session until after we've heard from all of the presenters. But we do strongly encourage you to ask your questions early as possible, because that means we've got time to make sure that we've seen the question and we can pull it together and make sure that we don't miss it when we start in the question time. So the earlier you ask the questions, the better. Now this afternoon we have, at least we were going to have Lynetta Russell, who's our Principal Advisor Services and Standards, moderating the questions. Unfortunately, Lynetta has had some technical problems connecting into the system, so if they aren't able to be fixed, then we will be doing that here at Alzheimer's New Zealand, and I will let you know about that a little bit later. Another thing about the Demio platform just to be aware of is that as we've been using it for these webinars, we've learned that if you have a number of tabs open or you have a number of windows open or both, there can be a lot of delay and buffering in the system, and it can be quite blurry. So if you are one of those people who keeps lots of tabs and windows open throughout your day, it might be a good idea to close those now, at least the ones that you're not using. And a quick reminder too to our speakers this afternoon, please keep your video and your microphone off until I introduce you, just so that we can make sure that we manage the background noise and other things through the afternoon. And finally, we've adopted a practice in these webinars of acknowledging and thanking each speaker after they've finished their presentation with virtual applause. So I will cue you in for when you can do that, but please join me after we've heard from each speaker. So, with all of that housekeeping, I'm delighted that we're about to get on with this webinar and what you've all come to listen to this afternoon. So, I mean, I guess those of you who know us at Alzheimer's New Zealand will know that our philosophy goes something like, be ambitious, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so this afternoon, I'm so excited that I'm announcing the launch of our new exciting education initiative, the Dementia Learning Centre, which is going to be a hub of excellence for dementia education here in New Zealand. And the kaupapa of that centre is really around people and the right that we all have as individuals to exercise our human rights. And that absolutely applies to people living with dementia as well, and to be supported, valued and loved as we live our lives. And our view is that one of the very best ways that we can go about doing that is by helping to build the skills and expertise of families, of people living with dementia, and also for those of us who are working in the dementia sector. And of course, those of you who are familiar with the Dementia Action Plan will know that strengthening the leadership and capability in the sector is one of the 4 key actions under that plan. So this is in many ways our way of supporting and delivering on that. So we had planned to launch the centre back in April, and I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody why that hasn't been possible. But our work on this new Centre of Excellence really started in earnest in June when Dr. Peri joined us, and she's been hard at work over the past 5 months setting everything up so that we could get to this launch today. It's been a big job and it's so exciting to be here now. I know I'm repeating myself, sorry, but I am excited. But an absolutely huge thank you to Kathy for all of the hard work that she has done to get us to this point. Now, many of you will know Kathy. She's a specialist nurse in the health of older people space. She's a researcher, she's an educator. She's been leading the development of CST programs in New Zealand for the past 5 years alongside Dr. Gary Chung. And of course, she's been working as the director of the Dementia Learning Centre for us since June. So look, really excited to be at this point. Just also want to say a big thank you to Freemasons Foundation and Ryman Healthcare for their generous support for the setup of this program, and also to Lotteries for their funding. But now I am delighted to hand over to Kathy, who's going to be talking to you about her vision and plans for the centre. And Kathy just happens to be sitting next to me, so just bear with me for a moment while I just pan the camera around.
Thank you, Catherine. Kia ora, everybody. Well, as Catherine just has introduced me, I've been, the story begins long before I got here to set up the centre. Excuse me, there's been mounting evidence that the dementia care and support in New Zealand needs greater investment, both in the workforce and by those caring and for those living with dementia. This evidence can be found in some recent research reports, such as Our Lives Matter, Getting Our Heads Around Dementia in New Zealand, our Dementia Declaration, and as Catherine mentioned earlier, the recently relaunched Dementia Action Plan. As you can imagine, establishing the Dementia Learning Centre has required a number of tasks to get here today. And as a dementia educator and clinician, it made perfect sense to me that the underlying philosophy of the Dementia Learning Centre would be embedded in the Tom Kitwood's definition of personhood. The learning activities and educational programs will be based on the key elements that he has suggested to be essential as the psychological needs for people with dementia. And to name a few, these include attachment, comfort, occupation, identity, inclusion, and finally, and most importantly, we think, is alaha. The idea being that personhood becomes not just best practice, but eventually becomes standard practice across the health sector and the community. The centre will be hosted on the Alzheimer website and will be accessed through this landing page. If you just bear with me, here we go. Yes, now is it? The centre has been blessed with the Māori translation that holds great meaning with the kaupapa of our centre. Te putahi akorangi mō te mate wari. Putahi has an established meaning as a centre and is conceptualised as a place to go, with ako being a reciprocal learning and teaching place, a place where people will come to learn and grow. The koro within the flower embraces this concept as the koro represents the spiral of lifelong learning. And also I'd like to mention that the flower also is a visual representation of what Kit would originally use to display his essential concepts and elements for personhood. Now, I guess you're all excited about, well, what is the centre going to offer next year? Well, here we go. Firstly, and most importantly, in the work that I've been doing since I've been in the centre, is to develop an online program for people with dementia and their care partners. So in March, we'll launch an online self-directed learning program targeted for the care partners, families and whānau. And later in the year, we will launch a person with dementia online learning program, which will be a facilitated learning activity for our people living with dementia. Alongside that, we will be developing a series of education webinars. These educational workshops will deliver latest and most up-to-date dementia research and evidence around some clinical practice. And the first year we're intending to focus this particularly for RNs and who will be able to use this as part of their professional development hours. And the third thing that we are excited to share with you today is that cognitive stimulation therapy, which some of you will already know that Dr. Gary Chung and myself, the international CS trainers here in New Zealand, Alzheimer New Zealand has offered us a home for CST. And so that'll mean that Gary and I will continue to run the workshops, but the administration and the CSC web page will be found within the Learning Centre. The fourth activity that we're planning to do is have ED. ED is an interactive virtual reality experience, and Alzheimer New Zealand has secured this exclusive rights to bring this program to New Zealand, and again we'll be delivering that program again in early 2021. When the final activity that we plan to deliver is bespoke education programs and workshops, and offer dementia consultancy activities from experts that will be within the Dementia Learning Centre. Excuse me. We have also established an educational quality group who will provide peer review and quality assurance to the centre's activities. Now, for those who are interested in learning a little bit more about the centre or want to find out how they might be able to engage in some of those activities that I have just mentioned, you can access this through the education@alzheimers.co.nz email. And now, I'd like to thank the sponsors again, who've turned what I have always felt as a pipe dream into a reality. Now, Catherine, I'd like to hand it back to you to present our next speaker.
Whoops, that's me just going the wrong way. Just bear with me while I get the technology under control here. Here we go. getting back there. Very good. All right. Look, thank you so much, Kathy, for that. And thanks also to Dr. Gary Chung, who is part of bringing cognitive stimulation therapy into the Dementia Learning Centre. It's great to have you on board as well, and I know that you've joined the webinar. So please join me in thanking and acknowledging Kathy for her comments there. All right, so now moving on to our second speaker this afternoon, Daniella Greenwood. So Daniella is an international consultant, author and speaker on human rights policy and practice, with a particular interest in long-term care, and she's just recently developed a human rights framework for aged residential care in Australia. So Danielle is going to really be challenging us this afternoon for how we should be thinking about human rights in this long-term care context, and how we can have human rights at the centre of everything that we do, and also what some of the barriers might be to us being able to achieve that. So really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Daniella. I'll just stay on the screen until you've got your camera on and your microphone on.
Camera and microphone on. How is that going?
Excellent. Wonderful. That's great. I will go, and thank you. Really looking forward to it, Daniella.
Thank you. Wonderful the technology is working. And thank you for having me. This has been a fantastic series. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm really honoured to be part of it. As you said, my presentation looks at the practical side of implementing human rights for real people in the world of practice, including looking what has been tried and failed in terms of protecting the rights of the most vulnerable. The work I'm presenting here builds on years of experience in aged care, and also my recent dissertation, and as was said earlier, my recent implementing this model. I have no idea why it's working through there. My recent work actually developing a human rights framework for Mercy Health organisation here in Australia. So moving this slide along. Fantastic. I think it's clear to everyone that the denial of human rights in all care contexts for people with dementia, it's been well established, and that things are particularly poor for people living in moderate to later stages of dementia, who have been my focus because they're the people who keep falling through the cracks of these types of rights-based connections and protections. And I've concentrated on the tiny moments in residential aged care that make up people's lives as citizens living in that space. But a story from Heather in the last webinar that I attended for you guys, it really highlighted that people face this type of treatment no matter where they live. It was around some chocolate biscuits and COVID. Basically, people living in the community gave their children their shopping lists so they didn't get a risk of getting COVID and going out there shopping. And the children knew better and decided to change the list based on what they thought was best. And of course, chocolate biscuits were the greatest casualty. And I found that kind of thing pretty much everywhere in relation to people living with dementia. And most importantly, it's perpetuated by good people normally, who feel that they're doing something good by making other people do what they feel is good for them. And making other people do what we think is good for them is paternalism, and paternalism is the antithesis of human rights. So there's so little time today, I didn't know whether to show this quote, but I don't think there's ever been a better one in relation to paternalism, especially the bit that says people will torment us for our own good, and they'll do so without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. And there is no time today to go into paternalism, but Dworkin notes that there are different types of paternalism. There's rational, conscious, unconscious. And he goes on to note that in getting to the point where paternalism is even considered, a threshold is required in relation to understanding the severity and likelihood of the harm or benefit. So to truly work out how human rights work and don't work for people living with dementia, we absolutely have to look critically at the tiny everyday spaces where people live their lives, because these remain the key sites for unchallenged and unquestioned oppression and injustice. So today I would like to show you just one of those tiny moments of people that make up people's lives in residential aged care. It may be
you know
a bit
what?
stuttery,
I'll put
but
down
I
in my
think
progress
you'll get
notes that you've
the
requested
idea.
not to give her any more desserts.
That's really appreciated. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So I just wanted
from
to
the
talk about
beginning.
Mum. She seems to be putting on a lot of weight lately. I really want to cut out the desserts.
Look, I get it. We've been trying to cut down on her food intake.
Yeah, because she sits around, she's not active, and I really just think the desserts need to stop.
Well, she's sneaky. She'll just take some extra desserts and put down in her top drawer.
She really is.
You know what? I'll put down in my progress notes that you've requested not to give her any more desserts.
That's really appreciated. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care.
See ya.
And did you hear that? Just that casual conversation in the dining room that was held between the son and the nurse. There was no dignity that existed in that conversation. I think that's clear for everyone. Even the tone and the way they spoke about it, even the name calling. This is just about a son who's demanding things of his mother's body that he's clearly not even demanding of his own body. And a nurse who's treating day-to-day choices like as though they're critical clinical decisions. So there's not even a conception of a threshold for this paternalism. It seems like everything's up for grabs, and both of these people will walk away feeling good about themselves. But if that person who they're talking about actually does protest about this imposition of having her choices overridden, there's a really good chance it'll be documented as a behaviour related to dementia. And then restraint and drugs are on the cards. So these are serious matters in the real world of day-to-day practice. I think the real horror personally around all of this is just the casualness with which that all happens. No one's hiding it. And Barak describes this kind of casualness and business as usual oppression as institutional structural violence. It's the medical model that's justifying and shaping the ethics of practice and that interaction we saw there. And paternalism is a legacy of that medical model where what is good for someone is frequently distorted into some kind of clinical good. So let's take a quick look at what's been tried so far. What have we tried to put in place to secure rights for vulnerable people, but particularly people living in moderate to late stage dementia? Of course, we've had person-centred care that's based on really individualised information that's provided by family, usually at a really stressful time. And so we get this kind of proxy static snapshot of a resident's preferences and identity, but it offers no challenge to that highly paternalistic context. And so people are still bossed around for their own good, just now in a much more individualised way. And as with relationship-centred care, there's not really a conception of unequal power dynamics within those relationships. Think about the movie with the son and the nurse. That'd pretty much tick all of the boxes in terms of what's currently considered, best practice and engaging with family, etc. We've had the culture change movement, and that's proposed, a whole range of operational shifts, but it's presented those shifts as nice to haves, things that require staff buy-in. There've been a whole range of spiritual, lifestyle, psychosocial and arts-based programs, some of them really gorgeous, but an afternoon choir or intergenerational activity or visit from an elder clown offers at best only a short recourse from these day-to-day oppressions, and at worst these programs feed into that paternalism and oppression. I mean, if we're all honest, I'm sure each of us has witnessed some of those engagement opportunities that are just so age inappropriate, some of them quite humiliating, with funny hats, fake medals, deflated balloons. So moving on, there's been in new approaches to physical design and living areas, from small households to huge fake villages to group home models in people's own homes. But the video and the chocolate biscuit incident really show us that this kind of oppression can occur no matter the physical design or living arrangements. So we've had dementia training, and there isn't time to go into that today, except to say briefly that it's the system and the symptoms of dementia framework within this training makes it really difficult for staff. And I used to work on the floor. It really makes it difficult for us to recognise things that we would normally recognise in other people and even in our own selves. Things including and especially expressions of pain, self-respect, self-determination. So there's really no possibility for human rights for people living with dementia in care until that's been resolved. So we've had consumer-directed care, aged care standards, charters, and a whole host of initiatives, but that are underpinned by this choice and rights framework. But for people living in moderate to later stage dementia, we really have to ask just who's making these choices, and how are residents directing services and care and claiming their rights? I mean, how are we listening to people who don't use words anymore to express their preferences? This whole choice and rights framework has failed to secure the rights of the most vulnerable, especially those who express their preferences non-verbally and in the moment, or who frequently have these expressions pathologised. So the World Health Organization is onto this, and they've really asked for human rights to guide these services, and they make specific reference to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to guide frameworks and staff training in this space. And briefly, the Convention on Rights for Persons with Disabilities was developed as it became pretty clear over time that some groups, including people with disabilities, weren't enjoying the same access or standard of rights as others. And the definition of disability is really broad. It includes sensory, physical, intellectual, cognitive, and other disabilities. And most of the people receiving care and support in institutions or in their own homes experience one or more of these disabilities, including the disabilities that come from living with dementia. So I'd just like to highlight probably the most contentious but definitely most relevant aspect of the CRPD, which is Article 12. This seeks to address that legacy of paternalism and the stripping away of human rights associated with substitute decision making. It highlights that everyone, absolutely everyone, has the right to make their own decisions and to be provided with decision-making support, giving effect to their current will and preferences. And this concept of current is vital in relation to people living with dementia. It shifts us beyond that, I want mum to do this, or mum would have never done that, which is basically saying this person before us doesn't exist except in what I remember from her from the past. So of course we can do better, and we need to do better. Having a quick look at summing that up, a human rights framework represents a complete paradigm shift away from this current highly paternalistic and deficit-based domains of medicine and charity. Just to be clear though, and this is really important, excellent clinical care is not in a dichotomous or binary relationship with human rights. Everyone needs to stop pretending to be confused about that if we've got any hope of meeting our human rights obligations. It is just about recognising that everyday decisions, preferences, tasks and expressions in residential aged care and at home that are central to rights should not be subject to clinical sanction, the desires of others, or institutional efficiencies and imperatives. It's a clear move away from that paternalistic best interest approach, and of course it really demands a vigilance in eradicating harmful training and framework that deem any of those intentional acts of communication and self-assertion as pathological behaviours. In a residential aged care context, it means flexible routines are needed, of course, to support day-to-day and in-the-moment preferences of residents, and these become non-negotiables to support human rights rather than as nice-to-haves requiring staff buy-in. And so too with consistency in staffing in all contexts. It is not rocket science. The more you know someone, the more you will understand their expressions of preference, pain, joy, self-assertion and personality. This familiarity is particularly vital when working with people who express themselves non-verbally. And so consistency becomes a requirement to support self-determination and decision-making in all contexts. And through the lens of human rights, failure to provide reasonable accommodations, such as consistency in staffing, is discrimination and a violation of fundamental rights. So finally, in putting all this together for Mercy Health, who I worked for here in Melbourne, first of all, we started by determining those operational shifts required to support human rights, and we classified them as non-negotiables. Same with a whole range of practices, non-negotiable with clear consequences. But I think the key has been to clarify Article 12 for everyone from day one, where the current will of a resident is a measure of their self-determination, and it's a matter of human rights that this be upheld. Utilising supported decision-making if and when it's needed, giving effect to the residents' current will and preferences, commitment to respecting verbal and non-verbal expressions of will and preference equally, and making that threshold for paternalistic discussions really clear to everyone. To do this, I developed a human rights assessment tool to ensure there was consistency in aligning their existing policies and procedures with the CRPD. There was establishment of a new role, a dedicated human rights executive with codified authority above clinical, and a human rights ethics committee to oversee the transition. And this consists of experts in relevant fields such as ethics, human rights law, disability law, elder abuse. You cannot leave the interpretation of law, human rights, or aged care standards up to a single quality manager or a clinical team. These interpretations have profound impact on the day-to-day lives and freedoms of people that extend far beyond clinical knowledge and considerations. So this involved a comprehensive human rights training and orientation program, and the movie we just saw came from that. The training needs to have a strong critical component to ensure that all staff are aware of the legacies of the medical model and the power of these institutions, and of course the agency of everyone in working together as peers in overcoming this. It requires a conscious move beyond psychosocial training and approaches alone, where the focus is on making staff have nicer and more loving thoughts and feelings, and this is fragile. At best, we cannot leave the rights of people at the mercy of what mood people are in and whether they have nice thoughts and feelings. And so solidarity becomes the defining characteristic of staff practice and of staff-resident relationships. And this is solidarity as a citizenship practice, as defined by action researcher Kabir in her citizenship and human rights work with marginalised and vulnerable people in the Global South, which she defines as the capacity to identify with others and to act in unity with them in their claims for justice and recognition. So that's my short version of it. There's my contact details if anyone wants any more information in terms of, there's presentations I can point you to. So.
So thank you, Daniella. I so enjoyed that presentation, and I have a long list of questions and thoughts that that sparked for me. So I do hope we get a chance to discuss some of those at the end of this. But certainly, you know, from my perspective, I don't know how many people of my age that I hear talking about exactly this issue in respect of themselves, including about things like other people making choices about chocolate biscuits or other things, but not necessarily making the connection in terms of their decisions and process in relation to their loved one or others. So, you know, absolutely, we have a very long way to go on that, and I really look forward to some further discussions. So please join me in saying thank you very much to Daniella, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Now, just a reminder to everyone Please do ask your questions in the chat box. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see it, just click on the chat icon, which you will see at the top right, and it will come up. We have some four fabulous speakers this afternoon. So this is your opportunity to ask some questions directly, and I know that they're really looking forward to responding to those. So get your questions in early. All right, well, now I'm delighted to introduce our second speaker this afternoon, Graeme Titcombe. And I know that Graeme will be very well known to many of you. He is currently the Chief Executive of the Community and Home Association, and has been in this sector for a very long time, including 16 years as the Chief Executive of Access Home Help, which is where I first met him. So Graeme was also awarded as an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2018 for his services to the sector, home support and the community. So this afternoon, Graeme is going to take a visionary perspective on what he thinks about this question of human rights and support services that are being delivered in the community. So Graeme, looking forward to hearing from you this afternoon. Just turn your camera and your microphone on for us, thanks. Right, all right, okay. Over to you, Graeme.
Well, thank you very much for the privilege of presenting today. For those of you that don't know the Home and Community Health Association, we are predominantly providers of home support under contract to district health boards for aged care services, the Ministry of Health for Disability Services, and for ACC for accident-related services. Also, there is a wide plethora of other contracts in regard to chronic disease management, to short-term delivery, post-discharge, etc. So the members that we represent deliver services to just over 100,000 clients throughout New Zealand via 17,000 support workers. Interesting enough, in terms of aged type services, that's probably about 65% of all services. And what we note is the continuing aging of that population. So 41% of all clients are now aged over 85, and we can see a steady increase in that number. 56% of all clients are at risk of hospital or residential admission, and 58% are living with chronic diseases, and 25% and growing are those with moderate or severe cognitive impairment. Now, obviously, the topic today is to look at some of the issues around what we see as areas where not only would we show where we would like to go, but also where we would like some feedback. So 1 in 4 of home care clients has a diagnosis of Alzheimer's and or other type of dementia. 44% of diagnosed home care clients are between 75 to 84 years of age. So they are younger than our general population for home care services. Men were more likely, 12.5% more likely to be diagnosed with dementia, and Maori and Pacifica are also more likely to be diagnosed with dementia. One of our big issues here is that in terms of the Maori and Pacific population, 7% of our clients are Maori, 4% are Pacifica, yet the population for Maori in New Zealand is 16.5% and 7.4% for Pacifica. So we are not actually providing the services that we need to that particular client group. One of our great challenges is that we need partnerships and liaisons. Home care cannot live in isolation. It is an integral part of the delivery of a service, and by its very nature, it is only there for a small portion of a client's total needs. With 17,000 support workers delivering roughly 350,000 visits per month, we are in dire need of increased training for all of our staff, obviously including in dealing with challenging behaviours. And so I was particularly pleased to hear of the Dementia Learning Centre. It's one thing that we will follow with interest, and I'm sure it is one that I will personally be encouraging every provider to liaise with, because training is our greatest need. Specifically, with dementia, one of our issues, of course, is that we need client-specific training as well. Not just general training, but also no two clients are alike. Equally, clients living with dementia can also be living with other chronic conditions, can be living with a disability. So training has to be very client-specific. I wanted to really raise today that we need greater recognition and responding to the needs of the family. So we need to respond to the wider family and not just to the client. So the two issues that I really want to look at today were really around the needs of the family, the wider and the family carer, and also in looking at changes that we need to consider and develop in the coming years. One of the biggest stresses that comes through from all providers, if I ask them what is the biggest major issue in delivering services to this client group, and it is the primary caregiver expresses feelings of distress, anger, or depression. And that's a chart from Interact in terms of the percentage of clients that feel this anger and frustration. The problem with family stress is the lack of respite care, and we're talking about an availability of an external respite care services that differ area by area, availability of homes respite is inconsistent by DHB. So we're really talking, not only are we talking about external respite care, the biggest problem as expressed to me by providers is the availability of in-home respite. And even when respite is available, it is generally too limited. Now, as an industry, we have recognised this, and we are working with the Ministry of Health and DHBs on getting a more consistent approach to all services for aged care, but dementia will be high in the list of priorities. One of the problems we have at the moment is, of course, the differing methods of contracting, commissioning and funding of home support services, DHB by DHB. So at the moment we have approximately half of the DHBs in New Zealand based on a fee for service. So you are paid so much for delivering service of so many hours to an individual client. That availability can depend DHB by DHB, but equally the problem is that it is very, very specific in what you do and what you don't do. In other words, you don't have flexibility. The second group of DHBs around the country are what they call the bulk funded case mix model, where you are funded for the category of the deemed category for that client, which is based on assessments but those assessments can be quite irregular. Again, the problem is that each DHB by DHB actually funds that in a different manner and at different levels, and again, we don't have the flexibility. But it's wider than that. We actually need to see integration of organisations. When I say integration, I'm meaning cooperation of organisations and actually delivering these services. So it is not one service by one service by one service without any joined up mechanisms. The other issue that I really want to raise today is that we are seeing developments in technology. Again, the development has been frustrated by funding mechanisms and contracting mechanisms. And most of you are familiar with the wearable sensors, locators, wearable I can never pronounce that word, accelerometers, detecting falls, medication monitoring, monitored alarms, smoke alarms, and the list goes on. Many of them are single incident markers, so basically they are detecting only for that particular issue. So wandering or detecting a fall, monitoring medication remotely, all of these have got a place. But I think that we have technology now that actually enables us to develop a whole area further. But with this will also come risks. And talking about Daniella's talk about respect and actually making sure that we don't impose things is going to be a real challenge. So one of the ones that really interests me is work currently being done and trialled by Australian CSIRO. And looking at motion detectors for instant movement, accelerometers for mattress movement, power sensors for electrical power draw by appliance, acoustic sensors for water flow in pipes, temperature sensors, humidity sensors, reed switch for opening and closing of doors, pressure sensors for things like couches. All this technology currently exists and is being utilised in one form or another in all sorts of environments. So in terms of a typical sensor installation, you may have detectors on reed switches on external doors, you have power meters, you have motion sensors to tell when people are going in and out of bathrooms, you can have detectors on mattresses to know when people get in and out of beds, you can have acoustic sensors. But the real development, we believe, so you're detecting wandering, you're detecting sleep patterns, you're detecting meals being prepared or not prepared, washing, clothing, visiting bathrooms, house cleaning, postural transfer. All these are capable of being detected. The exciting development really in terms of where CSIR are going and trialling is to actually integrate this. So in fact, to use wireless monitoring of all of these sensors into one system and then building on that system in terms of using machine learning so that you can know changes in patterns, so you can detect difference from the norm, that you can detect alarms, you can detect all sorts of things in terms of a growing pattern for that individual client. Then the ability to transfer it to a smart app for use by families for the monitoring of alarms, to know when bathrooms are flooded or elements have been left on, to a clinical portal for adjusting services. I mean, simple things like detecting the fact that normally We would like somebody in the home when the person wakes up and gets out of bed. But everybody, of course, doesn't have similar patterns of sleep. And to detect that, in fact, the client has been waiting 3 hours every morning to get out of bed, when all we had to do was know that and to change the pattern of the support worker, would have made a major difference. Obviously, this also means that we have a workforce that is going to have to change. And our workforce average age is about 55 years of age, and it is aging. We need a more diverse workforce. We need increased Maori and Pacific services, special services with trained personnel delivering service in a model that is acceptable to the Maori and Pacific peoples, not something that is imposed upon them. We need a younger workforce that can actually work with technology. And through all this, we actually need to keep, as Daniella said, we need to keep staff consistency. And that is going to be one of the real big challenges for us in the coming years. So this data that will be presented to the person for self-monitoring, caregivers as a means for remote monitoring and for care assistance adjustment, home care providers to adjust services to meet changing needs, clinicians to support decision-making through examining changes in trends and ambient and activities of daily living, psychological, behavioural and vital signs. But as you can see, and I'm sure all of you've got this churning in your mind at the moment, there is also a whole issue around this of privacy and are we becoming too technical in terms of the danger of the response being too clinical, too technical and not enough of being person-centred or family-centric. So I would certainly welcome your feedback today on all of these issues while we actually evaluate some of the technology to see which we believe would be useful, but more importantly, what you believe, what the families believe, and what the person believes would be of most assistance. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your feedback.
Thank you, Graeme. That was fascinating. It was really useful to hear something about the demographics and the issues faced by the client group that's been supported by community and home health services here in New Zealand, but also touching on those issues about the nature of the kind of the model, the issues with respite, and love to come back to that at the end if we've got time, because that's something that we're very interested in as well. And also asking those questions about how can technology support but not overwhelm and certainly not challenge human rights in this context. So really enjoyed that. Looking forward to the discussion later. But right now, let's just join me in saying thank you to Graeme. All right, so we're now moving on to our final speaker this afternoon, Jack O'Neill. And I think I owe Jack something of an apology because I think I was so excited about both the webinar and launching the Dementia Learning Centre that I rather forgot to give you a last name when I mentioned you before. So very happy to have you with us, Jack. So Jack O'Neill is a lecturer in architecture at Unitec, and I first met Jack a couple of years ago after he'd finished some research, and he was looking at this question about design and architecture and dementia and how spaces can support care. So today that's exactly what he's going to be talking about, how the architectural design decisions can help prioritise people in their context so that they can live their best possible lives. So Jack, I know there's going to be a great deal of interest in this, in what you've got to say, so just turn your camera and your microphone on for us. I'll just make sure that everything's working. It'll just take a minute.
Is that all working?
That's all working. So over to you, Jack, and we'll looking forward to hearing what you've got.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. Where to start? It's been some fantastic presentations, and I suppose for me, really, this is research that I initially started in 2016. And if I jump through, it all was born out of a family connection with dementia. Both my grandparents on my mother's side had a form of dementia. And one of the interesting things while studying architecture is you learn a sense of empathy for those you are designing for. But it really went firsthand for me. I was sort of helping make decisions around where my family would be cared for, helping my mother reconcile her feelings around dementia and how it's affecting her parents. So it's been quite a long journey, but as it fed into my master's thesis, I found it an incredibly rewarding experience. And what I will do today is discuss this question that I posited in 2016, which is really how can architecture enable people with dementia to live a fulfilling life in care? Now, this was a sort of question I landed on after much deliberation. And sort of the first step, at least at my end, and at the time when we were doing the study, was defining what a fulfilling life is or could be. And what we settled on, based on the research, was privacy, autonomy, and sort of the combination and control of these becoming a form of dignity, personhood, and happiness. And so over the course of the year, and lots of work that's going to be incredibly difficult to sum up quickly today, but I'm happy to take some questions and discuss further at the end, we sort of came to this, what we call an architectural toolkit or matrix for care environments. And what this is I suppose, a series of opportunities or ways of structuring space or designing rooms or places in order to facilitate, hopefully, creating more opportunities for a fulfilling life while in care. And today I'll discuss a number of these briefly. So materiality, this is a topic well understood by most, but really the materiality of a lot of care environments is not particularly well suited to people living with dementia. What we see is it's the white walls and the shiny floors are typically placed in these environments because they're easy to clean and they meet the New Zealand Building Code standards. And what the research would suggest is that this makes it incredibly difficult to navigate and understand space. Poor material choices increase a phenomenon called site disturbance. And in more extreme cases, there's sort of clear evidence that this promotes fight or flight reflexes. And this has obviously caused a lot of issues for both the person with dementia, living with dementia, the family, but also the staffing. And some other interesting information that's come out is that a sort of a minimum information load from the environment is required to function normally, and understimulation promotes depression. And I suppose what we're sort of suggesting there is that the blank white walls are actually incredibly understimulating for your brain and for your eyes, and they do nothing to really exercise your cognitive ability. So really the focus going into this next step is that sort of a clarity of materiality, focusing on natural materials that have a complexity of scale to them, which I'll discuss, and reintroducing ornament and decoration to care environments. So really trying to get a sense of definition to the spaces. Now, I use the term scales of complexity, and this is quite an interesting structure of I suppose, the world is that if you look at a tree's a great example. If you look at a tree from a distance, it has roughly the same amount of complexity for your brain to interpret as it does when you're right up close to a leaf. And this is incredibly beneficial for your eyes and for your cognition. And what at least the studies that we were researching into, this was often a very calming and reduced anxiety a great deal. So what we found is in these sorts of environments on the left, where you have long white corridors, you're not really getting any complexity. I mean, the ceiling in this space is starting to do some work, it's starting to become quite interesting. But actually, it's a pretty linear space, and probably the most concern I have with this space is actually the lack of definition between the floor and the walls. So the diagram on the right is sort of suggesting that, you know, one simple opportunity is to make the skirting line, the border between the walls and the floor, more evident, so it's easier to discern the floor from the walls and to understand the path that you're going to navigate. Another small item is that the placing of the heaters or any other obstructions along the wall actually breaks this line and reduces that clarity. Another interesting point that came up was this idea of wandering. And at least in my experience with my grandparents, I found there was a real reluctance to encourage wandering. And all the evidence suggests it's incredibly high likelihood of wandering, and often wandering can lead to escape-seeking behaviour, which is incredibly logical. Our proposal based on the research is to provide continuous wandering paths where possible. And we really want to vary this, creating a range of lengths of wandering experiences. Having a clear and logical pathway with no dead ends or locked doors is critical. And what we'd like it to do is be representative of the street as opposed to a corridor. So if I flick back to this image, this is very much a corridor. We really want a little bit of the busyness of a streetscape, something that is enriching to walk down. And I think we all sort of understand what that might be when we think of places we like to go in the city. Somewhere with lots of visual interest. And again, interacting with multi-sensory environments or gardens. So again, these are spaces where we have great scales of complexity. So these are incredibly visually interesting and calming. This also feeds into the auditory aspects of that space. And in our research, we investigated different types of gardens from all over the world, really looking at the garden as a great tool to join spaces. And what we found was actually the traditional Chinese garden has incredibly beneficial structures and arrangements, potentially to be gleaned. And so why this is and why it's particularly the Chinese garden is actually they have quite short lengths of path. I mean, it's somewhat visible in this image on the left, but the idea that they're quite short staccato-like paths, but there's always sort of an end goal. But the idea of a Chinese garden is that you should never actually stop wandering, that you should be able to just meander through the garden endlessly and never arrive at a destination. But there will always be a destination visible that you're trying to get to. And I suppose looking at some precedents, you know, in the Netherlands, we've seen some really beneficial spaces to wander through, you know, the open courtyards. And I think we're starting to do this a lot better, and Australia has some great examples. But maybe a little bit of an ambition. I sort of look at this image on the right and I think, you know, I know we're not talking about hospitals today and it's not about hospitals, but I think there's something to that in the sense of this caring in an open environment as much as possible. Removing the sort of white, clean walls from around ourselves and getting outside as much as possible. Another item of the many we sort of investigated was the individual residence design. And again, in my experience in the research, there was incredibly poor structures to residences for individual residents. Often they were very small rooms. They had no sense of privacy and no real ability to control that privacy. So what we were encouraging in the research is to create complete residences with full amenities to allow autonomy for the resident. So this may even be being able to lock their doors, the ability to see out of their room and control the visibility into their room. And again, this idea that control is an incredibly important part. And then we also want to facilitate the visiting of family and friends and providing guest amenities within the resident's own space. When looking at international models that provided guest rooms, it was found that they were incredibly underused. And I think it's the difference, at least in my experience when visiting my grandparents, was I wanted to stay with them. I didn't want to stay in the care home or down the hall in an unfamiliar place. I think it's about being close. So trying to bring that into the room. And quick sketch analyses of these sort of spaces as an example is at the top, we have quite a poor layout. We have sort of a single bed in the corner of a room and a sanitary facility down the hall. And really the red area is the private space, and it's completely connected to what is perceived as the front door. If we go down to a slightly improved layout, by rotating the bed and making the space a bit bigger, we can connect to the sanitary facilities and push the entry to the room back away so that you cannot see into the space so clearly, and that there is a clear demarcation of entry space. Much like we'd have at our own homes, the idea of receiving someone in your bedroom is not particularly nice, so the ability to receive someone at the front door and tell them to leave if they so choose. This is a quick mock-up of potentially a full residence. This idea that we have this recessed entry that denotes the entry to the house. Next to it is a small kitchenette that looks out onto a shared area, the shared access way. And by defining this, we get the ability to passively observe people entering into our house. And then as they move in, hiding the entry to the sanitary facilities, providing a decent sized living space, and the ability to sort of pull out another bed for a family member, and providing outdoor living space as well. And I think one of the things that happens a lot in care environments is that we see that all of the socialization happens in public forums, and incredibly intimate and private moments with family members has to happen in a public space. Typically the rooms are too small or there's just one chair. And so trying to bring back this control into the space where potentially the resident doesn't leave that room in their outdoor living court for quite a long time, but if they're comfortable and they're happy and they have control over that, I don't think we can see too much of an issue with this. Another really interesting thing we just sort of happened upon was this idea of community meeting points. And people who live with dementia often live in care environments that are incredibly closed off from wider society or the local community. This distinct lack of interaction with and the familiarity of people living with dementia has been shown to reduce societal empathy quite significantly, and especially, I suppose, the personhood that is bestowed upon people living with dementia. So really this was an effort to re-establish empathy and personhood, and we wanted to create programmed gateways, I suppose, and connection points and opportunities to interact between the care environment and with the wider community. And each of these was to enable passive observance and familiarization at a very high level, and then create meaningful and controlled interactions between community and residents, considering safety. And then optimistically, we'd really like residents of the care environment to be able to provide value back to the wider community. And so in our explorations, I'll show you sort of two quickly, but what we were really discussing was the idea that potentially this happens over two levels, and a daycare would be a great example. The ability just for people living with dementia in these care environments to observe the daycare from a distance, and for the parents to get familiar, but potentially working right up to interaction and shared caring responsibilities. And people living with dementia in this care environment could actually take pressure off staff members. And this has been demonstrated in a number of places around the world, so it's a pretty familiar precedent. And the same goes for a library. We saw similar opportunities, and this is sort of one of many programs, I should say, that we thought this could apply to. And I think coming to the end of these talks, I'm well aware that a lot of this seems perhaps quite high level and quite conceptual. And there's a great quote, which is, "You cannot separate out good design, effective management, and user involvement when caring for people living with dementia." And I suppose this is a really nice opportunity to say that's completely correct, but we have to be aspirational, and we have to say there has to be a different way to do this in order to find out where we can land. So next year, in discussion with the researchers at Unitec Institute of Technology, the architecture department, we decided that probably the most interesting and progressive place to focus our efforts in 2021 is to develop the community connection points. Perhaps not quite so grand, but exploring how we can create interaction with a local community between a care environment with its local community. So next year we will be starting an elective course for students in the School of Architecture, which is focused on designing for people living with dementia. I'll be running this course along with other supervisors. And beyond that, a larger aspiration is that we encourage societal empathy within the individuals who will be designing these care environments. A lot of what prompted me was an understanding of and I suppose a true effect of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I guess what I see is a real opportunity to embed some of that understanding at a very early age with, I suppose, the next generation of designers and architects. They will be designing the care environments and coming up with these ideas in the future. So starting the conversation at quite a grassroots level. And ultimately, a long-term plan is to facilitate dialogue and conversation at a national level around the architecture of care environments. We are currently struggling between, and this will be a very topical issue at the moment, between issues of human rights, between building code compliance and best practice, and actually the realization that none of us live necessarily by these best practices and building code compliance strategies, and that the cleanliness of a surface is incredibly important, but is it at the detriment of the well-being of the person who lives in it? So it's a tricky issue, but that's where we want to get to. And I think we have to raise the bar of understanding, at least in the architecture departments and the research body. And then hopefully we can get to this dialogue at a national level as we move forward into the future. Thank you.
Really interesting presentation, and I just know that a lot of the points that you were making and the ideas that you were suggesting will really resonate with the community that's really thinking about this question about human rights. And how do we as a sector help people living with dementia to exercise their rights? And Jack and I have had some discussions a couple of months ago about possibly collaborating on some guidelines or something in the sector. So really look forward to the opportunity to continue in those conversations too, Jack. So in the meantime though, please join me in thanking and acknowledging Jack. Thank you. All right, so now we're moving on to the final section in this webinar, which is the opportunity for questions. And I need to start this session by just passing on Lynetta's apology to you, because we haven't been able to resolve the technical problems that are preventing her from being the question moderator this afternoon. I know she was very much looking forward to doing that, because many of you won't know that behind the scenes, Lynetta has been the person who's been doing the hard yards and pulling these webinars together. And so thank you to Lynetta for that, and I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to fix that for you. So Kathy and I are going to do the questions instead, and I'm going to start off and we'll see where we get to with the questions. But my first question is actually for Kathy. It's a relatively short one, but let me just pan around to Kathy and ask you, whoops, have us both on the screen, and ask you, because I'm sure that some people will be wondering, after you've talked about what we're going to be doing through the Dementia Learning Centre, they might be wondering whether they can expect some cognitive stimulation therapy workshops next year. So what are your plans for that?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so we do intend to run a workshop in February, and that one will actually be on the Zoom platform. So that'll be a new pilot. And so if you go onto the Learning Centre's website, there'll be some information about that in a couple of weeks' time. And I also just wanted to add briefly that we are actually writing a New Zealand manual for CST and at the moment, and also the maintenance manual. So they will also be available and be able to purchase through the CST site through the Learning Centre next year. Thank you, Catherine.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Kathy. Now, my next question is for Daniella. And I guess, as I said, I had a lot of questions arising from my session, and also looking at the questions coming up through the chat. And I was I was wanting to just explore a bit further that issue about all of the possible decisions and all of the choices, because I think, we work in New Zealand with a substitution model, sadly, around decision making, and it often leads to a situation where once a decision's been made to activate an enduring power of attorney, for example, then there seems to be some assumption that people can't make any decisions. And I was interested in your thoughts about how we can start to talk about that a bit more, to surface that issue, and to get some progress in that area of people understanding that there's a spectrum of decisions that everybody makes every day, and we all want to retain control of as many of those as we possibly can. So, Daniella, can I invite you to make a comment in response? Rather rambly kind of question/comment.
No, it's very, very relevant, and the sector is rife with a complete abandonment to what you've just spoken about. You'll find electronic care plans, paper-based care plans, particularly in a residential setting, where it's kind of just assumed that as soon as someone moves in, these powers kick in, and it's really important that we understand that people, first of all, before they move in, that it's made really clear to them what the approach of the organisation is. As I said in the end of my program, that legal powers can only be used for what they were meant for under law, and still focused on the current will and preferences of somebody. This is international law. You're a signatory. Australia's a signatory. I understand that there's a guardianship and powers of attorney laws, but these things don't kick in. There's also problems with this idea of next of kin that aged care seems to have really misunderstood. We find it used as a catch-all. So next of kin means this is the person I call when someone has a fall, or this is the person who's got a right to have a say, and there's actually no link to capacity or even legal powers. So at best, it's really messy. The approach is to make sure there's very clear guidelines around understanding who has those powers and who doesn't, and never breaking that. The next part is about making sure that families are clear from day one, and residents, so that they don't internalise this. And in a home care context, that will be privileging the person living with dementia, without a doubt, that even if we're having a conversation in a lounge area like you and I just had, it'll be focused on the rights of the person living with dementia, not your anxieties as a family member or my expertise as an aged care professional. So making that really clear involves creating resources. And with Mercy Health, I've got the CEO, made a video for family and a separate one for residents, letting them know this. So before they choose to move in, they know that no matter what powers are in place, that 100% will be privileging the current expressions of preference and will of the person. And if we can ascertain those, Nothing trumps it. And and absolutely establishing that threshold. So there are decisions around life and death. There are decisions of big ticket items that would need discussion. But anything that falls below that, we don't get to talk about it. These are freedoms that anybody in the community would expect. And just because people are receiving care in their home or have moved in to get further support, we don't get to micromanage all areas of their life. None of us would put up with that. And often residents aren't even warned. Resident citizens are not warned that this will happen to them. So moving to a human rights framework makes that a non-negotiable. So we no longer have to talk people into it or go to culture change conferences. It's just what we do, or you don't get accreditation, or you don't pass, or you don't, this is human rights makes that no longer talking people into it. It means we need to get on top of it and creating those resources for family, which, believe me, families really appreciate being informed about all of this. It's a relief to them. I can't.
Hear me is because I very carefully muted my microphone so I didn't provide you with any background noise, and then I was talking to you and forgot to turn it back on. So I've broken the cardinal rule of these kinds of sessions. All right, now a question for Graeme. So if I can get you to put your video and microphone on, Graeme, that would be great. One of the things I was interested in as you were working through was, and I was pleased that you did this, that you described a little bit about the kind of the way the services are paid for and how that affects what the providers in your association are actually able to do. And I know that, there's a lot happening in this space around funding models, particularly for community and home support services at the moment, and this, push for a shift to individualised funding. And that's going to be, I think, inevitably going to be part of the future, and there are some real benefits in that in terms of the choices that people can make. But equally, we need, as you made the point, a well-trained, well-supported, flexibly available workforce. So I was interested in your thoughts about how those two arrangements might be able to work together.
Yeah, I think individualised funding obviously is a growing trend, and interestingly enough, while the advantages of individualised funding have been well recognised, the same can't be said in terms of more home-based services with a workforce, where flexibility is still something that is, I was going to say frowned upon, that's not right, but isn't really taken into account. So I think that, in fact, as individualised funding develops, I think there is a learning for the wider health home-based service in terms of providing a more flexible funding. One of our real problems, of course, is that we have 20 district health boards, 20 funding mechanisms by those district health boards without any common national service standard or national funding methodology, etc. Now, something that is being worked on, perhaps with the Health and Disability Review, with the reduction in numbers of DHBs, it will assist, but we do need more flexible funding. I mean, simple things that if you currently have a service from a provider, a funder, a DHB that is fee for service, they will pay you for hours of delivery. If you look at the example I'm putting in there and use of technology, then in fact, if we put technology into a client's home, we wouldn't get paid for doing it, we wouldn't get paid for monitoring it. If we reduce the hours, the income would go down because you're only paid for the service delivery of a support worker. So we've got to get rid of all those sorts of inflexibilities to have a service that actually is responsive.
Very good, thank you, Graeme. And I actually have a follow-up question about the technology, but I'm conscious of time, and I'll get you just to turn your video and your microphone off, because my final question for this afternoon is to Jack. So if you could turn your camera and video, camera and video are the same, aren't they? Thank you very much. You knew what I meant. I don't know why I'm trying to explain it. So I think fascinating presentation. Thank you, Jack. And I'm sure that that's prompted lots of thinking for lots of people, just in terms of what's possible. There'll be lots of questions underlying all of that about how it's affordable, and there's lots to happen in that space, I think, in terms of taking some of your ideas forward. One of the things that I was immediately interested in, though, is, if we think about what is currently known about or considered to be best practice in terms of environment for people living with dementia, particularly when they've got quite advanced dementia, is trying not to make those environments too busy. Trying to minimise the unnecessary distractions in an effort to provide something calming. But I agree with the points you were making, that taken to an extreme, that can create an environment that can be completely sterile, provide no level of stimulation at all. I'm just wondering, have you got some background noise in your place? Or does somebody else have their...
It's awfully quiet, so hopefully not.
There's just some background noise coming through at my end, so I hope it's not disturbing those of you who are listening. So we'll keep going. If any of the speakers have their microphones on, though, please turn your microphone off. Anyway, I was interested in your perspective on how to get that kind of balance. So not overstimulating, but not creating something that's sterile for all of the reasons that you, I think, quite clearly set out.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly nuanced thing to try and get right. I think there's quite a difference between visual and auditory noise and a sense of it's hard to express. Look, I think what I was trying to allude to maybe is that there are things that can be visually busy, but they are quite calming in the sense of looking at trees or watching the ocean. These things are actually inherently very busy for your mind to take in. They're always moving. They're fractal in nature, so they're very, very detailed. But actually, it's about bringing on a sense of calm because of that. What the research would suggest is that a plain blank white wall, it's a gib board, we see that as calming, but it's more of, and I'm veering into neurology, which is always dangerous. It's more of it's calming because we have a conceptual understanding that it's calming. We understand that we're safe. We understand that it's simple, it's clean. But actually, when we start to remove perhaps that, or that conceptual understanding of the world starts to fall away a little bit, what the research suggests is that those natural environments with a bit more visual busyness and maybe a bit of wind and a bit of rain and a bit of all the good stuff that we kind of like to go for a walk in the park to see, that seems to be much more conducive to a calming person. And some of it, I think, is a little bit counterintuitive. And I agree that it's something, especially when we get to the larger scale of a care environment, that needs to be managed correctly. It would definitely be easy with all of the signs and all of the lights that we need these days because of the healthcare requirements to end up having a park with a whole lot of bright neon lights in it. So I think it's not that, but I don't know what the answer is, but it's definitely there to be figured out, is what I'd say. Does that make sense? Oh, we've lost you again. Sorry.
So I'm breaking the rules again. Helps if I turn the microphone on. I think, and I think there'll be lots more discussions about this and related topics in the near future. So thank you very much. I'll just get you to turn off again. And I'm very conscious of time. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for participating in this webinar series. I know that some of you will be watching it live and others dipping into it afterwards through the recorded sessions, but it's been great to have you join us, however you've chosen to do that. A big thank you to our speakers this afternoon, Kathy Peri, Daniella Greenwood, Graeme Titcombe and Jack O'Neill, and apology again from Lynetta for not being able to join us, and thanks to her for all her efforts in pulling this webinar series together. Great job, Lynetta. So this is now the end of the Dementia Rights are Human Rights webinar series. We have had a really, really positive response to the webinar series, but also the issues raised in it. And we'll be doing a lot more thinking ourselves about how we go about responding to some of these issues, the things that we can do to help, and how we can collaborate with and work with other people to do that as well. So watch the space, including through our Dementia Learning Centre. We're really looking forward to that. Anyone who wants more information on the Dementia Learning Centre, you can do that on our website, alzheimers.org.nz, and on the website you can also get a link to talk directly to Kathy if you would like to do that. Also, a reminder that we will be exploring these issues at our conference, which is about a year away on the 18th and 19th of November. So watch the space as well. In the meantime, thank you very much. It's been great to have you again. Thank you again to our speakers. Ka kite anō.